"Your daughter will never amount to anything," my sister Victoria said, looking straight at my 8-year-old daughter Emma playing in the backyard. "She's too quiet, too weird, and frankly, Rebecca, you're raising her to be a failure just like you." 5 years later, Victoria was sobbing on my doorstep in Millbrook Heights, begging me for $15,000. When I told her my answer, she realized just how wrong she'd been about both of us. It was supposed to be a normal Saturday barbecue at my house in Willowdale. Nothing fancy, just burgers, corn on the cob, and my daughter Emma showing off her latest art project to anyone who'd listen. The kind of lazy summer afternoon where the biggest worry is whether we'd run out of ice for the drinks and if the mosquitoes would get to bed before sunset. I'd been planning this barbecue for weeks. It wasn't often that I got to host family gatherings anymore, not since my divorce from Emma's father 2 years earlier. Money was tight, tighter than I like to admit, and entertaining wasn't exactly in the budget. But Emma had been asking when Aunt Victoria and Uncle Marcus would visit again. And I figured it was time to make an effort. Family mattered, even when family was complicated. My sister Victoria had always been the successful one. Even as kids growing up in Cedar Brook Falls, she was the one who got straight A's without trying, who made varsity cheerleading as a sophomore, who seemed to glide through life collecting achievements like some people collect stamps. I was the dreamer, the one who spent too much time reading fantasy novels and writing stories that would never see the light of day. Victoria used to tease me about living in my own world. But back then it felt like sisterly ribbing, not cruelty. She'd married Marcus Delacroix right out of college, a finance guy from Thornbury who looked like he'd stepped out of a catalog for expensive watches. They lived in one of those massive houses in Riverside Estates, the kind with a circular driveway and windows that probably cost more than I made in a year. They had twin boys, Tyler and Connor, who were 10 now and everything Victoria had ever wanted in children: loud, confident, athletic, popular. The kind of kids who got trophies for everything and made sure everyone knew it. Emma was different. She was 8 then, this quiet, thoughtful kid who spent most of her time drawing elaborate fantasy worlds in her sketchbooks instead of playing with dolls or watching cartoons like other kids. While Tyler and Connor were out there dominating Little League and junior soccer, Emma preferred to sit under the old oak tree in our backyard, sketching dragons and unicorns and elaborate castles with towers that seemed to spiral up into the clouds. I loved that about her. Loved how her mind worked, how she could lose herself for hours in her own imagination. But I also worried. Not because there was anything wrong with being creative or introverted, but because I knew the world could be cruel to kids who didn't fit the mold. I'd been one of those kids myself. The barbecue had started well enough. Victoria and Marcus arrived around noon in their gleaming black Escalade, Tyler and Connor spilling out of the back seat like they owned the place. Victoria looked immaculate as always, designer jeans that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, a silk blouse that somehow stayed perfectly pressed despite the August heat. Her blonde hair swept up in one of those effortlessly elegant styles that would take me 3 hours and a team of professionals to achieve. "Rebecca," she'd called out, arms spread wide for a hug that felt more performative than genuine. "This place looks quaint." That was Victoria speak for small and sad. My little rental house in Willowdale wasn't much: 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a postage stamp yard that I was slowly turning into a garden. But it was home. Emma and I had made it ours over the past 2 years, painting the walls cheerful colors and hanging Emma's artwork in cheap frames from the discount store. Marcus had given me one of those awkward side hugs that men do when they're not quite sure how to interact with their wife's divorced sister. "How's the job search goin'?" he'd asked. And I could tell Victoria had briefed him to ask. I'd been working as a freelance graphic designer since the divorce, picking up projects where I could find them. It wasn't stable, but it was flexible. And it meant I could be there when Emma got home from school, keeping busy, I'd said, which was code for barely keeping my head above water financially. But thanks for asking. The boys had immediately taken over the backyard, kicking a soccer ball around and generally being boys. Emma had watched them from the porch for a while, clutching her latest sketchbook, before retreating to her favorite spot under the oak tree, I'd seen her stealing glances at her cousins. And I could tell she wanted to join in, but she was too shy to ask, and they were too caught up in their own world to invite her. That should have been my first warning sign. The way Victoria watched Emma sitting alone. This expression of mild distaste crossing her face, like Emma's quietness was somehow a personal affront to the natural order of things. She's gotten so withdrawn, Victoria had commented, following my gaze to where Emma sat cross-legged in the grass, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. She's not withdrawn, I'd said. Maybe a little too defensively. She's just focused. She's been working on this amazing comic book for months. Victoria had raised an eyebrow. Comic book, it's actually really sophisticated for her age. The storylines are complex, the characters are well developed. Her art teacher says she has real talent. Victoria had said in that non-committal way that somehow managed to convey volumes of judgment. Emma had been excited all week about showing her aunt the comic book she'd been working on. 43 pages of detailed drawings and storylines about a girl named Luna who could talk to animals and save magical kingdoms from evil sorcerers. She'd spent months on it, staying up past bedtime with a flashlight under her covers, perfecting every panel, developing intricate plot lines that honestly impressed me with their creativity and depth. The story followed Luna, a young girl who lived in a world where humans and magical creatures had been separated by an ancient curse. Luna discovered she had the rare gift of being able to communicate with both worlds, and she became a bridge between them, helping to solve problems and prevent conflicts. Each chapter introduced new creatures: wise talking owls, mischievous forest sprites, noble dragons who were nothing like the monsters in traditional fairy tales. What struck me most about Emma's comic was how thoughtful it was. Luna didn't solve problems with violence or magic spells. She solved them with empathy, with listening, with understanding different perspectives. In one chapter, she helped a lonely troll who was terrorizing a village not out of malice, but because he was afraid that everyone hated him. In another, she mediated a dispute between the water spirits and the fire spirits who couldn't understand why their elements were considered opposites instead of complementary. Emma had even created detailed maps of Luna's world, with different kingdoms and territories, each with their own customs and challenges. She developed languages for some of the magical creatures, simple but consistent systems of communication that she'd use throughout the story. For an 8-year-old, it was remarkable work. But more than the technical skill, what moved me was the heart of it. Emma's comic was fundamentally about connection, about finding common ground between different kinds of beings, about the power of understanding and compassion. It was the kind of story the world needed more of, and it came from the mind of my quiet, thoughtful daughter who saw magic in everyday moments. I'd been encouraging her to share her work with family, thinking it would help them understand who Emma really was beneath her shy exterior. I'd been hoping that Victoria, in particular, would see what I saw, that Emma's quietness wasn't a flaw to be fixed, but a strength that allowed her to observe and create and imagine in ways that louder kids often couldn't. As the afternoon wore on, I'd watched Emma gathering her courage. She'd been clutching her comic book, stealing glances at Victoria, clearly working up the nerve to approach her aunt. Finally, round 3 o'clock, she'd taken a deep breath and walked over to where Victoria was sitting in one of our patio chairs, scrolling through her phone. "Aunt Victoria," Emma had said, her voice barely above a whisper, "would you like to see my comic book?" Victoria had looked up from her phone with that slightly annoyed expression people get when they're interrupted from something important. "Your what, sweetheart?" "My comic book. I've been working on it for months. Mom says it's really good." Victoria had glanced at me with a look that clearly said, "Of course Mom says it's good." But she'd held out her hand. "Sure, let me take a look." Emma had practically glowed with excitement as she'd handed over her masterpiece. She'd stood there fidgeting with the hem of her t-shirt, watching Victoria's face hopefully as her aunt flipped through the pages. But Victoria had barely looked at it, just flipped through quickly, spending maybe 2 seconds on each page, her expression growing more and more skeptical. Emma had started explaining the story, her voice getting more animated as she described Luna's adventures, but Victoria wasn't really listening. She was scanning the pages with the same expression she might use to review a restaurant menu she wasn't particularly interested in. "It's cute," Victoria had said finally, handing the comic book back with the kind of dismissive smile adults use when they want to humor a child but can't be bothered to actually engage. Emma's face had fallen slightly, but she'd pressed on. "Did you see the part where Luna helps the dragon family find their lost egg? I researched real dragon mythology for that part." "That's nice, sweetheart," Victoria had said, already looking back at her phone. But Emma hadn't given up. "And look at this map I drew of the crystal caves. Each crystal has different magical properties. And Luna has to figure out which ones to use to break the curse that's keeping the forest spirits trapped." That's when Victoria had looked up with that expression I should have recognized sooner, the same look she used to give me when we were kids and I'd try to tell her about a book I was reading or a story I was writing. Patience stretched thin, barely concealed irritation, and something else, something that looked uncomfortably like contempt. "Emma," Victoria had said, her voice taking on that artificially sweet tone that adults use when they're about to say something crushing but want to pretend they're being kind. "This is all very imaginative, but don't you think you might want to try some activities that are more practical?" Emma had blinked, confused. "Practical, you know, sports, or music lessons, or I don't know, math club? Things that might actually help you in the real world." I'd felt my stomach drop. I'd opened my mouth to say something, but Victoria had kept going. "I mean, it's fine to have hobbies, but you can't spend your whole life lost in fantasy. At some point, you have to learn to live in the real world." Emma had clutched her comic book tighter, her eyes starting to fill with tears. "But I do live in the real world. This is just for fun." Victoria had sighed, the kind of long-suffering sigh that suggested Emma was being deliberately difficult. "Sweetheart, I'm just trying to help you understand that there's a difference between childish games and actual achievement. Look at Tyler and Connor. They're out there playing sports, developing real skills, learning how to compete and win." As if on cue, we'd all turned to look at the boys, who were currently engaged in what appeared to be a contest to see who could kick the soccer ball into the neighbor's yard the most times in a row. Real skill development, clearly. "But I like drawing," Emma had said, her voice getting smaller, "and writing stories. Mom says I'm good at it." And that's when Victoria had looked at me with that expression I'd seen 1,000 times growing up. The look that said I was being naive, that I was setting Emma up for disappointment, that I was failing as a parent by encouraging something so impractical. "Of course Mom says you're good at it," Victoria had said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Moms are supposed to say that. But Emma, honey, you have to understand, being good at something and being able to make a living at it are two very different things." I'd felt heat rising in my chest. "Victoria, she's 8 years old. She doesn't need to worry about making a living right now." Victoria had turned to me with that look of barely concealed exasperation. "That's exactly the problem, Rebecca. You never think about the future. You never think about preparing her for reality. Drawing and storytelling are real skills," I'd said, trying to keep my voice calm for Emma's sake. "They're valuable. They matter." Victoria had laughed, actually laughed, like I'd just said something adorably naive. "In what world, Rebecca? You need to face facts. The world doesn't pay people to sit around drawing pictures and making up stories. Well, maybe 1 in a million people, but the rest end up," she gestured vaguely at me, "at my small house, at my clearance rack clothes. Like this." The silence that had followed felt like the world had stopped spinning. Emma's face had crumpled. She'd clutched her comic book to her chest like it was a shield that might protect her from the words that were hanging in the air. But Victoria wasn't done. She'd looked at Emma with that same dismissive expression and delivered the words that would echo in my head for years. "Your daughter will never amount to anything." She'd said it matter-of-factly, like she was commenting on the weather, like it was an obvious truth that everyone should just accept. Emma had made a small, wounded sound, not quite a sob, but close. She turned and run toward the house, her comic book pressed against her chest, her shoulders shaking. I'd stood there, frozen, trying to process what my own sister had just said about my child, the casual cruelty of it. the absolute certainty in her voice. But Victoria still wasn't finished. She'd looked at me with that same cold assessment and added, "She's too quiet, too weird, and frankly, Rebecca, you're raising her to be a failure just like you." The barbecue had ended pretty quickly after that. Marcus had made some excuse about needing to get the boys home for dinner. Tyler and Connor had complained about leaving early. Completely oblivious to what had just happened, Victoria had gathered her purse and her sunglasses like nothing had occurred, like she hadn't just eviscerated my 8-year-old daughter and then used her as ammunition against me. "Think about what I said," she'd told me as they'd walked to their car. "I'm only trying to help." I'd found Emma in her bedroom, face down on her bed, her comic book open beside her. She'd been crying quietly into her pillow, the kind of careful, controlled crying that kids do when they're trying not to make too much noise. "Mama," she'd said when I'd sat down on the edge of her bed, "is Aunt Victoria right? Am I weird?" I'd wanted to tell her that Aunt Victoria was a bitter, cruel woman who measured worth in trophies and tax brackets. I'd wanted to tell her that being different was a gift, not a curse. I'd wanted to promise her that the world would see her talent and her kindness and reward her for it. Instead, I'd pulled her into my arms and said, "You are perfect exactly the way you are. And your comic book is amazing." But what if she's right? Emma had whispered. What if I never amount to anything? That night, after Emma had finally fallen asleep, I'd sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and stared at the business card Victoria had left behind, Marcus's company logo embossed in gold foil, his title Senior Vice President of Investment Strategy printed beneath his name in elegant script. I'd had no idea that 5 years later, Victoria would be standing on my doorstep in Millbrook Heights, mascara running down her cheeks, begging me for money. I'd had no idea that the weird, quiet little girl she dismissed so cruelly would become the answer to prayers Victoria didn't even know she'd need to make. But that night, all I knew was that my sister had broken something in my daughter, and I had no idea how to fix it. The weeks following Victoria's visit were like watching my daughter disappear in slow motion. Emma, who had always been quiet, became almost invisible. She stopped showing me her drawings. The comic book that had been her obsession for months was shoved into the back of her closet, and when I asked about it, she just shrugged and said she wasn't interested anymore. "Maybe Aunt Victoria was right," she said one evening as I tucked her into bed. "Maybe I should try something more normal." Normal. That word felt like a knife twisting in my chest. My 8-year-old daughter was already learning to dim her light to fit into someone else's idea of acceptable. The change wasn't dramatic enough for teachers to notice, but I saw it. Emma started sitting differently at the dinner table, shoulders hunched inward like she was trying to take up less space. She stopped volunteering answers in class, even when I knew she knew them. Her art teacher, Mrs. Holloway, called to ask if everything was okay at home because Emma had suddenly stopped participating in the advanced drawing workshops she'd been so enthusiastic about. She says she wants to focus on more practical subjects. Mrs. Holloway told me, confusion evident in her voice. "But Rebecca, Emma has real talent. It would be a shame to waste it." I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive to Victoria's mansion in Riverside Estates and shake her until she understood what she'd done. But what would be the point? Victoria had always been the kind of person who believed that being right was more important than being kind, and in her mind, she was absolutely right. She'd identified a problem, Emma's impractical dreams, and provided a solution. Crush them now, before life did it later. 5 years later, Emma was 13 and everything Victoria had predicted she'd never become. Her graphic novel series Luna's Kingdom had been picked up by Starlight Publishing after going viral on social media. The same quiet, weird little girl who would never amount to anything now had 3 published books, a movie deal in development, and a fan base of over 2 million followers across platforms. The irony wasn't lost on me that Emma's success came from the very thing Victoria had tried to crush: her imagination, her art. Her ability to create worlds that resonated with people who felt different, misunderstood, weird. We'd moved to our dream house in Millbrook Heights 6 months earlier, purchased with Emma's advance money. Emma had insisted on a huge art studio with floor-to-ceiling windows. For when other kids visit, she'd said, I want to show them that being different is actually pretty cool. That's when Victoria showed up. I was in the garden when I heard the car door slam through the hedge. I saw her stumbling up our driveway, designer clothes wrinkled, hair disheveled, mascara streaked down her cheeks. This wasn't the polished, confident Victoria I remembered. This was someone broken. "Rebecca," she sobbed the moment I opened the door. "I need your help. I didn't invite her in." I just stood there, remembering an 8-year-old girl crying into her pillow because her aunt had convinced her she was worthless. "Marcus left me," Victoria continued, words tumbling out desperately. "Took the boys, the house, everything. The divorce lawyer says I'll get almost nothing because of the prenup. I've got nowhere to go and I need $15,000 to get back on my feet." I watched her fall apart on my doorstep, the same woman who had looked at my brilliant daughter and seen only failure. "Please," she whispered, "your family. You're all I have left." That's when Emma appeared beside me, taller now, confident, wearing a t-shirt with her own book cover on it. Victoria's eyes widened as she recognized the artwork, the same style she'd dismissed as impractical 5 years ago. "Is this the aunt who said I'd never amount to anything?" Emma asked calmly. Victoria's face crumpled. "Emma, I thought I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything." Emma studied her aunt with the same quiet intensity she'd always had, the same trait Victoria had once called weird. "Mom always taught me that our success isn't measured by other people's failures," Emma said finally. "But it's also not our job to rescue people who tried to tear us down." I looked at Victoria. Really looked at her. 5 years ago, she'd stood in my backyard and tried to convince an 8-year-old that her dreams were worthless. Now she was learning what worthless actually felt like. "I'm sorry," I said, stepping back. "But Emma and I have learned something important about family. Real family builds you up. They don't tear you down and then expect you to save them later." I closed the door. Through the window, I watched Victoria sit in our driveway for 20 minutes before finally driving away. Emma had already returned to her studio, working on book 4 of the series that would never amount to anything. We never saw Victoria again.